You think? Okay, all right. Well, then Scott, I tell you, here's another guy that's a blessing. He's over now the Forsyth County GOP and organized for the first time, guys. Listen, for the first time in this state's history, the state GOP convention began with a call to prayer and worship. The first time in this state's history, and it was it is this guy that made that happen. I want you to put your hands together and welcome Scott Cumbie. Scott?
Well, I get to play cleanup today, I guess. Following Bill, that was tremendous. Thank you, Bill, and Major Getz, Major Dave. Thank you for those words. I just sincerely appreciate the passion for our country. Let me add to something Bill said just a moment ago. During the Revolution, a third of the colonists were patriots, a third were loyalists of the crown, and a third didn't care. There was no majority. And I think that's what Bill was trying to tell us. There was no majority among the colonists. But it was a third of the people decided we cannot stand for this any longer. We desire freedom more than we do tyranny. And they stood up for that. And what do we have today? That's what our Senate needs to be doing. There are a group of people in the Senate that are not a majority, but they need to stand up with a loud voice and say, we've had enough. We're going to stand on the law and the Constitution.
Yeah!
Now, those of you that have heard me speak recently, there's three things that I like to tell people you need to walk away with, and I'm going to summarize those real quick. I don't have time to go into any. I'm sorry, I don't have time to go into depth, but let me just summarize them real quickly, and we can talk about them later. The first thing is we've heard part of that today. It's those 56 words from the Declaration of Independence, 236 years ago today. Was voted on in the Continental Congress. Those 56 words that begin, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson told us in those words a number of things. First, that it's our God, it's our Creator that's given us our rights. Our rights are not given to us by government. Our Second Amendment constitutional rights that we refer to, those are rights that the Constitution protects. They are ours, period. The First Amendment, those rights listed there, those are our rights, period. They're not rights that the Constitution grants us. They're not rights that government gives us. They're rights that we own and possess because we are created by God. And it goes on to say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The purpose of government is to secure those rights. And if you look at anything that goes on in our government today, if you listen to the news media and you filter what you hear through these 56 words, you can immediately find the problems that you're hearing from the media, from politicians, not from statesmen, but from politicians. Our rights are given to us by God, and government's purpose is to secure those rights. That's the first thing, those 56 words. If you can't memorize them, I'd encourage you to memorize them, but if you can't, know them, love them, be able to pull out your pocket Constitution or pocket Declaration and explain it to somebody. The second thing is the purpose of a Constitution. A Constitution creates a government and it defines its powers and limits. That's its purpose. A Constitution, our Constitution, does not limit us. It does not tell us what we can or cannot do. It limits government. And we can't forget that. That is its purpose. So you and I cannot violate the Constitution. You and I cannot stand up and do anything that violates the Constitution. But government can, and government does every day. They did last Thursday, in fact. The third thing to remember is what I call the first principle of American government. Woven throughout the fabric of our founding is one very important principle that I'd love to argue with you one day. And that principle is the principle of self-government. I believe if you wrapped everything up into one thing that our founders were fighting for, that was it. Self-government. The right and freedom to govern ourselves. So those three things is what I'm encouraging people to remember, if you remember nothing else. Number one, those 56 words from the Declaration. Number two, the Constitution creates our government and it defines its powers and its limits. And especially I want to underscore the word limits. And thirdly, the first principle of American government is self-government. Now with that in mind, let me just touch real quickly on what happened last Thursday. If you haven't read the Supreme Court decision, I'd encourage you to do that. It's not difficult to read. No Supreme Court decision is difficult to read. You just have to look at the words, read them for what they mean, and find all the heresy in it, honestly. Let me read you a couple of things out of this opinion. The first thing, Justice Roberts says, in our federal system, the national government possesses only limited powers. The states and the people retain the remainder. Now that is a very constitutional statement. But unfortunately, almost every Supreme Court decision you read says exactly the same thing, and then they proceed to explain why the power of government is expanding with this decision. It goes on to say the federal government is acknowledged by all to be one of enumerated powers. That's another phrase you see in almost every Supreme Court decision I've read. The federal government is acknowledged by all to be one of enumerated powers, or powers that are listed. There's 17 powers in Article 1, Section 8 that we, the people, have given to our federal government. And that's it. That's all the federal government's allowed to do. Roberts goes on to say the Constitution grants Congress the power to regulate commerce. Okay, now that's on the first page of the decision, and that is not true. The Constitution does not give Congress the power to regulate commerce. The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate Congress in only 3 instances. And unfortunately, this gets repeated throughout the document, throughout the decision. And it's left to think that Congress can do that, but Congress cannot. The Constitution says this: Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce, and here are the 3 things, with foreign nations, and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. And that's it. Congress cannot regulate any other commerce, cannot regulate anything that happens here in the town of Pilot Mountain, because that power is not granted in the Constitution. Now the Constitution, Article 6, says this: the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all the treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. Okay, so it says very clearly here, the Constitution is the supreme law. All laws made in pursuance of the Constitution is the supreme law, and any treaties made under the authority of the Constitution is the supreme law. There is no other supreme law. That's it. And it continues and says, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. So every judge in every state is bound by the supreme law of the land, or the Constitution. Now why doesn't it say the Supreme Court or the federal courts are bound by the Constitution? It's because Article 3 creates the federal courts. It actually creates the Supreme Court. Congress created the inferior courts, or the federal courts underneath the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is a creation of the Constitution. Therefore, the Constitution is superior. Unfortunately, that is not the view of the Supreme Court today. The view of the Supreme Court is that their precedent, their opinions, are the supreme law of the land. Now listen to this next thing in the decision last week. Our precedents, okay, here's now the supreme law of the land. Our precedents, and referring to the Commerce Clause, okay, our precedents read that that the Commerce Clause means that Congress may regulate the channels of interstate commerce. So they're going to list 3 things that they believe that the Commerce Clause allows Congress to regulate. The first is the channels of interstate commerce. That is a true statement. That's what our founders said. We find that in many writings of the founders. The channels of interstate commerce are roads, rivers, the ocean. Secondly, persons or things in interstate commerce, so anybody directly involved in interstate commerce. So it would be, today, it'd be truck drivers are involved in interstate commerce. And thirdly, those activities that substantially affect interstate commerce. Now that is a falsehood. That is a lie. That is not anywhere in the Constitution. You do not find anywhere where our founders say anything about that. Congress does not have the authority to regulate activities that substantially affect interstate commerce. Now it goes on to say, the powers over activities that substantially affect interstate commerce can be expansive. Now that's an interesting word, and I use that word a number of times in this decision, expansive. Now, if you remember what they said earlier, it says, in our federal system, the national government possesses only limited powers. So if they possess only limited powers, how can they have expansive powers? I really think the Supreme Court could benefit from watching Sesame Street. These two things are not the same. Limited and expansive are not the same thing. And this is what I meant earlier. Almost every Supreme Court decision you read, they always repeat that. Limited and enumerated powers. And they proceed to explain why, in this case, we're expanding the power of government. The power over activities that substantially affect interstate commerce can be expansive. That power has been held to authorize federal regulation of such seemingly local, notice the word local, matters as a farmer's decision to grow wheat for himself and his livestock. This is referring to a decision that the Supreme Court made back in the 1930s, where FDR, Congress at that time, passed a law that limited the amount of wheat that a farmer could grow. And this one farmer decided he was going to grow his limit plus some for his personal use. And he was fined by the federal court system because he violated that law. So how in the world can a Congress of limited and enumerated powers be able to tell a farmer what he can grow on his land? But this is what's happened to our country. Our Supreme Court doesn't care what the words say in the Constitution. They could care less. They are going to make decisions based on what they want to do and what they think is right. They are, as we've heard this spin this week, they are trying to protect, in this last decision, the integrity of the Supreme Court. I want to know when they're going to start protecting the integrity of the Constitution. Now, one last statement from that decision, and I've only gotten to 5 pages, okay? There's plenty more in that decision, and I've only touched on a few things in the first 5 pages. This last statement, Congress already possesses expansive, there's that word again, expansive power to regulate what people do. Where do you find that in the Constitution? Where we have granted Congress, or delegated to Congress, the power to expansively regulate what we do. Folks, this makes no sense. This is what we're fighting against. And let me tell you, I don't care how conservative Justice Roberts claims to be or people thinks he is. When he violates the Constitution, which he did in that decision, it is time for him to go. It is not time for him to resign. It's time for us to impeach him and remove him from office. He is taking from us our very freedoms, and we can no longer stand for this. There are 5 justices sitting on the Supreme Court today that do not belong there. One of those justices, in fact, you heard a few months ago, told the Egyptian press that if she were to write a Constitution today, she would not use the U.S. Constitution. Now, the irony to me is there is only one government in the world today, only one government in the world today as old as ours, and that is ours. Every other government in the world today has changed its government at least one time, if not many times. So we have the most stable government, the most stable country in the world. And yet we have a Supreme Court justice who took an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution, that stood publicly in opposition to our Constitution and said it's not good enough. And she would not use it to write another Constitution. Folks, that statement alone is enough to impeach her, in my opinion. Now let me finish. We heard some of these words. I think I heard the Declaration is going to be read, but I'd like to finish up with a few words from the Declaration because it is so good. Following those 56 words that I read quoted just a few minutes ago are these words also from Jefferson. He said that when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, remember the purpose of government is to secure our rights, and when any government becomes destructive of that, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. Now in our case, we don't need to institute new government. We need to reinstitute old government. The government that has worked for so long. We need to reinstitute that. Laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect safety and happiness. So the reason we need to reinstitute old government is to reinstate safety and happiness. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces the design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their safety, for their future security. Now, if you read the Declaration, immediately following this are those 27 reasons that our founders listed for separating from Great Britain. If you read those, they are eerily familiar today. Unfortunately, it sounds too much like what's going on in our country today. And let me go back, Major Dave said a few minutes ago, that about the Declaration. It is the foundation of our Constitution. If you don't understand the Declaration, you cannot fully understand the Constitution. Those 27 abuses and usurpations listed in the Declaration, they are all resolved with the Constitution. The Constitution addresses every one of those 27 abuses and usurpations. If you don't understand the Declaration, you will not understand fully the Constitution. In fact, I'm reminded, this always reminds me of one of our other justices, Elena Kagan, when she was in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Senator Tom Coburn was asking her about the Second Amendment. He got frustrated with her answers and finally just said, Ms. Kagan, do you believe in unalienable rights? And her answer, and I'm paraphrasing here, she said something along the lines of, you would not want me to rule on any such belief, but instead you want me to rule based on the law and the Constitution. What she said by that statement is several things. Number one, she doesn't understand that the Declaration is the foundation of the Constitution, so therefore she doesn't understand the Constitution. And number two, she doesn't understand that God has given us our rights. What she believes is that government gives us our rights, and if whatever government giveth, government can take it away. But if God has given us our rights, no one can take those things from us. And lastly, at the end of the Declaration it says, we therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to, and notice this was written by our agnostic, atheistic, deistic founders, appealing to the supreme judge of the world. And folks, as Major Dave so clearly stated, our founders were Christians. They were undoubtedly Christians. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, I've been reading a lot about him lately. I really thought, personally, that he probably was not a Christian, but the more I've read about him, and read his writings, I've realized that the man was just not very open about what he believed religiously. But I think he was a Christian. At the very least, he was philosophically a Christian. He was the one that wrote these words in the Declaration. Appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and the authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these United States are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And at the very end, it says, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Now, I've given you 5 references to God in the Declaration with this one. With reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Folks, it's time for us to step up and devote to each other our lives, our time, our effort, our resources, our lives, our fortunes, our money, our time again, and our sacred honor. We've got to stand up for people that are going to believe in our freedom and are going to fight for our freedom. And those people that claim to be Republicans and are in Congress but aren't doing anything because they don't have the votes, it's time to replace those people too. Yep. Thank you for your time.
Yep. Thank you, Scott. The guys brought some great leadership to Forsyth County. I mean, great leadership.